Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show. Got a fascinating show for you today. Kind of building on what we saw previously just a few days ago, where I did a video about a temple of Yahweh, of the God of the Bible, in Israel at the same time as the Temple of Solomon, but it's not the Temple of Solomon. It was contemporary with it, but there was some other stuff going on there. It was being um, dedicated to the worship of Yahweh according to the dimensions of the temple and instructions of the temple in the Bible, except there were also pagan worship and other things going on there. It was incredibly fascinating. So there was some good interest that the audience that you guys had in that video, and y'all wanted me to do some more videos along that line. So I'm going to do that. But this time I'm talking about another temple of Yahweh. However, this time it's not in Israel. It's one that was found in Egypt. And it's incredibly fascinating because there's so much going on with it. It confirms in some ways the book of Nehemiah. It seems to have had women priests, believe it or not. It was dedicated to the worship of Yahweh, the God of the Bible, but also included the worship of other gods as well. It was noteworthy for many reasons. This community actually wrote to the newly built temple, the second temple built by, of course, at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. They wrote to that community saying, hey, can you guys help out rebuild the temple over here in Egypt because it's been destroyed by some Egyptians? And so there's just wild stuff going on. There's even some evidence that maybe the Ark of the Covenant was at one point housed there. So this community, this Jewish temple in Egypt, is just noteworthy for so many reasons, and it's just a really, really fascinating case. So we're going to take a look at that. And by the way, tomorrow I am going to have an interview with a scholar on the question of Yahweh and the origins of Yahweh, and how does that line up with the biblical text about the origin of Yahweh, in addition to pagans worshiping Yahweh in antiquity in the land of Israel. And so what was going on there? So more to come on that. But before we dive into this particular one, I want to remind y'all, hit that subscribe button and the like button. It would help me out tremendously. Okay, so let me go ahead and just share my screen here. And we're going to talk about this Jewish temple in Egypt and on the Elephantine Island. They call it this because it's in the shape of an elephant. So this is approximately a 7th century community that was established. So before the Babylonian exile, believe it or not, Jews were already going here to Egypt to worship Yahweh at this temple. It's a fascinating case. So let's take a quick look at it. The Elephantine papyri and ostraka. These are, documents that they found from this community, are caches of legal documents and letters written in Imperial Aramaic, dating to sometime in the 5th century BC, although the community itself predates that to approximately 7th century. These papyri documents, and they document the presence of a community of Judean mercenaries and their families on Elephantine, starting in the 7th century BC, so before the Babylonian exile. You would think that this community would be after the Babylonian exile. No, it's right before then. The mercenaries guarded the frontier between Egypt and Nubia. Following the 587 BCE destruction of Jerusalem, some Judean refugees traveled south and, in what may be called an exodus in reverse, settled on Elephantine. So you had more people coming there after the Babylonian exile, but you had people going there and establishing this temple even prior to that. They maintained their own temple, a house of Yahweh. So they worshiped Yahweh here, but also other gods, in which sacrifices were offered, evincing polytheistic beliefs which functioned alongside that of Khnum. Now, this is not uncommon. We see even in the biblical text the people of Israel worshiping Yahweh along with many other gods. By the time of Isaiah, towards the end of Isaiah, it's absolutely clear. Isaiah is saying there's only one God, there are no other gods. But prior to that, many of the Israelites believed that Yahweh, the God of the Bible, was one among many. And so that's why you find temples all throughout Israel dedicated to Yahweh and others like Asherah. It's not clear when or why the Jewish community settled in Elephantine. The temple may have been built in reaction to Manasseh's reinstitution of pagan worship, or simply to serve the needs of the Jewish community. So Manasseh is like 700 BC to 640 BC, somewhere around there. And he was a bad king, and he imposed pagan worship in Israel, reinstituted pagan worship according to the biblical account. Maybe they were fleeing that and they were going there, but I don't know how that would exactly match up with the reality that this temple did engage in pagan worship. So I don't know why they would have an issue with Manasseh. But there was a conflict between the Jews and the Egyptians, and this is how the temple got torn down. Findings show that there was often culture interchange between the different communities, so the Jews there as well as the Egyptians. Conflict began after an Egyptian precious stone turned up in the hands of Jews. Also, you can just imagine if they're sacrificing bulls and goats. Well, these are worshipped by the Egyptians as gods, so obviously there's going to be some tension there. The earliest account of the Jewish temple is from 525 BC. In 410 BC, the Jewish temple, the house of Yahweh, was burned down by a Persian military commander after he was bribed by Khanum priests. While no explicit reason has been given for the destruction of the temple, it's suspected that the priests did this because of the Jewish rituals of sacrificing sheep, especially during Passover. You see, the Egyptians worship these as gods, and here the Jews would have been sacrificing these animals. That's going to create a lot of chaos. Papyri records records that have been collected from this time, or so papyri records that have been collected from this time show Jewish letters asking Bagaus for help rebuilding the temple. We'll look at that here in just a moment. In fact, I got a picture of it pulled up right here. You can see it now. This is what it looks like. And here's actually what it says. Jedaniah, the son of Gemariah, who holds property in Fort Elephantine, if our Lord will give permission for the temple of our God Yahweh to be rebuilt in Fort Elephantine. So there's an explicit reference that they were worshiping Yahweh along with other gods at this location. So come and rebuild in Fort Elephantine as it was previously. We agree that no sheep, ox, or goat is to be offered as a burnt offering there. Why? Because maybe that's what caused it to be burned down to begin with. But only incense and meal offerings. And we will make a donation to our Lord's household of 1,000 ardabs of barley. And it's fascinating because they're writing to the Jewish community in Jerusalem that has its own temple by this time. They've already rebuilt the temple. After the Babylonian exile, they come back. Cyrus the Great allows them to come back, rebuild the temple. So they rebuild it. And they're now writing to this community that already has a temple in Jerusalem, saying, hey, come help us rebuild the temple over here in Fort Elephantine. Now, that's just fascinating because it shows that they were under the impression that there's nothing wrong with having multiple temples. So to write to Jerusalem saying, hey, come help us rebuild this temple for Yahweh seemed to them like nothing unusual. Like, hey, yeah, it's good for us to have one in Jerusalem and over here and there, and we can worship Yahweh in all these different places. And not only that, but this is a pagan community because these are Jews who worship other gods as well as Yahweh, writing to the Jews in Jerusalem, saying, hey, come help us build this temple to Yahweh and other gods. That's pretty wild, right? There's a lot of assumptions there that the Jewish community there in Jerusalem would support them to worship Yahweh at a temple outside of Jerusalem, but to also worship other gods at this temple. It gets even more fascinating than that, though. Continuing here, papyri records that have been collected from this time show Jewish letters asking for help rebuilding the temple. The standard reference collection of documents is in the textbook of Aramaic documents from ancient Egypt. So that's where you can go and read more about what all they found in these papyri. But yeah, there's so much going on here. Let's maybe move over to this one from the Jerusalem Post that talks a little bit about it. Was there a Jewish temple in ancient Egypt? So it says just 100 years ago, they were searching for it desperately. German, French, and Italian archaeological expeditions were mounted to comb the lower stretches of Elephantine Island and the Nile River in southern Egypt, but without success. They had been activated by the publication in 1911, 2 years earlier, of papyrus document from the area that contained personal stories of members of a Jewish military colony in the area from the 5th century BC. So because this stuff turned up, they got this papyri documenting that there's a Jewish community here in Egypt. They said, okay, we need to go and find this. According to the document, there had been a temple in their midst of the colony. But where exactly? Was it real or myth? Was there a colony exactly? And why was it there at all? With the advent of World War I in 1914, the search was called off. It was resumed 1918, but again, without success. The papyrus scroll were specific. The Jewish colonists lived in peace with their Egyptian neighbors, and they kept the Jewish laws. And so you can actually read this in the papyri. They're talking about, don't eat leavened bread during this time. And so you can see them celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In fact, the Persian Emperor Darius II had commanded them to keep the Passover Feast of Unleavened Bread in 418 BC and not to drink beer for 7 days after Nisan the 14th, according to one of the papyri. The area at the time was under Persian control. It had been captured by Cambyses in 525 BCE, and the Jewish colony was under Persian jurisdiction. They occupied a whole row of mud brick houses. Some of them married Egyptian wives, and some did not. And altogether, they lived their lives in peace and quiet. Now, why were they there? They were a military unit serving there to guard Egypt's southern border. They were on Elephantine Island, opposite of Aswan on the mainland. And it was here, at the first cataract of the Nile, that Egypt had always had to defend itself against infiltrators from the south. But why were the Hebrews doing the job would be the natural question, right? The Persians were also keen to guard the border, and they trusted the Jews who had come to Egypt as refugees and were not allowed to work or to own land as citizens, but could serve as mercenaries. And that's why they did it. There was a whole colony of them. They built their houses, and it seems set them around a small temple, at least according to the papyri. And there's actually some evidence, archaeological evidence of the temple. There was no record of this Jewish colony in the history books, nothing in the works of Jewish historian Josephus, and nothing in the Talmud or any official Jewish records. Now, let that sink in. I want you to think through the implications of that. Because so many arguments hinge on there's no attestation to this in Josephus or the Talmud or in history books. And, this is often brought up to shoot down a lot of theories. But here's a case where we now have confirmed evidence of a temple at this location, a Jewish temple, and it wasn't recorded by all of these other sources. Now, I know that might be an argument for silence, for arguing for other things. I get that, but it just goes to show you, just because there is silence on some matters, just because they're not attested to in some history books, doesn't mean it didn't exist. And here's a case where that's now been demonstrated. Nothing at all in the papyri that had been found in 1893. So the world was desperate to see if they were correct. Had there really been a Jewish temple in Egypt in the 5th century BC? In 1893, the American adventurer C.E. Wilbur acquired a hoard of documents from locals on Elephantine Island. He could not read the Aramaic text, so he stored them in a sealed metal trunk, which passed to his daughter on his death in 1896. She eventually passed them on to Brooklyn Art Museum in 1947. However, other papyri on the subject had come into the hands of British and German scholars in 1901, 1903, and were quickly translated and published by the Germans in 1911. Among other details, the documents described a shrine standing in an open courtyard with an altar on which animal sacrifices were offered. So at one point, they were offering animal sacrifices. And again, this is probably why the community was destroyed, because that would have conflicted with some of the Egyptian neighbors. That's why they're saying over here in this letter, hey, if you guys in Jerusalem come and help us rebuild this temple over here in Egypt, we promise not to offer any more sheep and goats and ox. We'll just offer sacrifices of incense and meal offerings. Okay, so it continues. Among other details, the documents describe a shrine standing in an open courtyard with an altar on which animal sacrifices were offered. It had stood before the conquest of Egypt by the Persians, and Cambyses had spared it, although destroying other temples. It remained standing until 400 BC when the Persians were driven out by the Egyptians. It had been destroyed at one time by the priests of Khanum, who had an adjoining temple, but it was rebuilt again a few years later on the orders of the Persian governor. The priests of Khanum were powerful because Khanum was the ram-headed god who had presumed to govern the rise and fall of the... Sorry, let me block that out here. And now it just moved on me. Hold on. Let me find it. Let me scroll back up. Yeah. Who presumed to govern the rise and fall of the Nile from this spot at the first cataract. This was the story of the European expeditions, and they were desperate to find the temple. But after World War I, they lost interest, and it was not until 1967 that another expedition was mounted. And that's an important year because it was also at that time that they discovered the other temple of Yahweh that I mentioned to y'all in the previous show, the one where they were burning cannabis and incense and worshiping Yahweh and Asherah, Tel Arad. Well, that was at the same time. This was not to search for the temple, but to record all the pagan temples that have been built at this important site in southern Egypt. They recorded many Egyptian temples of various periods, but after many years also found what they called the Aramaic village. This was a series of mud brick houses and ruins that were lined up along two sides of a central site with a fine plaster surface and a small building paved in fine tiles. Luckily, Hebrew University professor Porton had published his plan of the Jewish colony houses based on the papyrus documents. And the German team recognized that what they had found were the Jewish houses around the temple site, all as Porton had predicted from the documents. The temple itself was small, just like the other one in Tel Arad. These are evidently, they're building small locations that worshipped Yahweh, like little tiny mini temples. In fact, only half of it remained, but it had a fine tile floor and two layers, indicating that the first had been destroyed and then replaced. It stood in a courtyard of fine plasterwork. All the houses only had crude mud floors. So this was the temple, and the papyri were true. So they were able to confirm the claims. The final discovery was only made in 1997, but it indicated a small Jewish temple in southern Egypt built to serve a Jewish colony that acted as a garrison to defend the southern approach to the rich country of Egypt. But it still goes to show that Jewish people at the time did not have necessarily, not all of them at least, did not have this view that you have to worship Yahweh in Jerusalem, or that you worship Yahweh alone, or that you have to have male priests. Oddly enough, we'll find out why there's some evidence that they had female Jewish priests. The Jews had acted as mercenaries to the Persian colonizers, so when the latter were ousted by Egyptians in about 400 BC, the Jews were in danger and might even be considered traitors. So what happened to them? There's no record in the documents. Hopefully they were not murdered, but more probably they assimilated and lived on with their Egyptian counterparts. There is, however, other possibility that they escaped. If they escaped, they could not have gone north back to their homeland. That would have meant 1,000-kilometer trek through enemy territory. Rather, they most probably would have gone south and may have even got as far as Ethiopia. This is why some people believe that this community that allegedly, potentially housed the Ark of the Covenant, then the Ark found its way into Ethiopia. Perhaps they settled there and showed themselves to be good Jews, keeping Passover and other mitzvot, and thus converting some of their Ethiopian neighbors to the true religion. Who knows? The author is a senior fellow at the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. Okay, so I thought that was a pretty fascinating one. Now, let's talk about the female priesthood here. It involves something that they discovered from this community. A Jewish curse text from the Elephantine community. Yes, they had a curse text. Here you can see it. It's really small, right? Only about 12 words. But there's a lot packed in to these 12 words. While the Hebrew Bible provides a great deal of information of ancient Israelite religion and Yahweh worship, there are very few extra biblical texts that inform us about Israel's religion prior to the Hellenistic period. According to Gad Barnea, a scholar of biblical history at the University of Haifa, a new text from Elephantine might finally provide a glimpse of how Israelite religion developed after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So it talks about this curse at Elephantine. Dated by its script to the 5th century BC, the tablet consists of 12 words, including a reference to the temple of Yahweh and one of the common epithets of Israel's god, the lion. At first blush, the text reads as an unusual letter or correspondence regarding a tunic. Barnea contends, however, that upon closer examination, the true meaning of the text becomes clear. It was a cursed tablet, very similar to cursed texts that would become a common a few centuries later in the Hellenistic period. So evidently, this was a popular thing. These texts, which were typically written as curses against thieves, were left inside temples as a way of transferring the stolen property to the deity, and thus turning the thief into a temple robber and liable to the wrath of the deity. So this is one way that they would have thieves not break into the temple and steal the stuff by basically saying, hey, all this stuff belongs to this god, and so if you steal it, you're going to be cursed. This is cursed. You remember that from The Mummy? It's a good movie. The small text, written in Aramaic on a pottery sherd, ostrakhan, was discovered during excavations on the island of Elephantine near modern Aswan in Egypt. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, Elephantine was a home to a thriving ancient Jewish community that had its own temple to Yahweh, priests, and sacrificial rituals. Barnea believes that ostrakhan may have originated from rituals performed in the temple. The ostrakhan gives us an intimate and direct access to a cultic ritual as it was practiced in Jewish temples in the early Second Temple period. Barnea told Bible History Daily. Its short text was carefully crafted with poetic features and seems to have been a template text used in cases of curses against thieves. Now, after more than a century of research on various texts found at Elephantine, it is clear that its early Jewish community had beliefs and rituals that differed considerably from those recorded in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, yeah, I'll say, certainly. Elephantine worship included polytheistic beliefs as well as practices influenced by Egyptian religion, because they're in Egypt, right next to pagan temples and all that. However, Barnea and other scholars suggest that the Elephantine community may have had much more in common with other Yahwistic communities of the time than the writers of the Hebrew Bible did. There's a lot of truth to that. As I've already demonstrated, other temples at the time of even Solomon's temple were temples dedicated to Yahweh and other gods. The curse text also reveals new details of how Yahweh was worshipped differently on Elephantine. Within the text, a female figure is told to command the lion. Command the lion, which would be a reference to the God of the Bible. According to Barnea, the female figure is most likely to be identified with the temple priestess who performed the cures ritual of dedicating the stolen item to the deity. If correct, this would be the first known instance of a priesthood within a Jewish temple performing cultic rituals. Barnea concludes this shows that women served in central cultic roles in Jewish temples at the time, and there is no reason to believe that this reality was limited to Egypt. So it may have been the case that you had Jewish priestesses in some of these other temples to Yahweh. This was in all probability also the case in other Jewish temples, including Jerusalem, Samaria, and Babylonia. Perhaps. Do we have direct evidence of that? No. But he thinks that it's likely the case that if you had this going on here, you had it going on there. But evidently, again, the cursed tablet indicates that this female priestess is supposed to command the lion and like activate the curse. So this is absolutely fascinating because there's just so much going on with it. And this isn't even the end. Now we got to talk about another matter, how one Elephantine papyrus from this community seems to back up the Book of Nehemiah from the Bible. Like there's just so much going on with this. I'm a little shocked, to be honest, that this isn't discussed more. I don't know why people aren't discussing this more, because there's so much going on with this community and a lot of implications to it, and it really shows us. It sheds light on a lot of things, I think, from the Bible, and here this confirms the historicity of the Book of Nehemiah by confirming one of the persons, a key figure in the Book of Nehemiah. This extra biblical document confirms it. So, Elephantine papyrus proving the Book of Nehemiah. Here's one of the papyrus. So, 2,500 years ago, a peculiar Jewish outpost stood guard deep in the land of Egypt on an island fortress within the Nile River. Today, modern excavations at this fortress have uncovered evidence adding to the historicity of the Bible. Preserved by Egypt's sandy, dry desert climate, the Elephantine papyri are a collection of 175 documents, thousands of years old. These documents were uncovered during excavations at this ancient Elephantine fortress. One papyrus letter caused particular excitement. This letter, unearthed in 1909, contains 30 lines of inked Aramaic text, imperial Aramaic text, dating to circa 407 BC. Known as Elephantine Papyrus number 30, or the Elephantine Temple Papyrus, which is pictured above. That's this thing right here. This document contains proof of two biblical figures in particular: Jehohanan, the high priest, and Samaria's governor, Sanballat, the Horonite. So now you have extra biblical evidence confirming some of these people mentioned in the Bible. As stated above, Elephantine was a Jewish military outpost located on a Nile River island deep within southern Upper Egypt. There is much debate as to the origin of this community. The best guess appears to be sometime during the reign of King Manasseh, middle of the 7th century, the 2nd century BC. The letter of Aristeas records that large numbers of Jews had come into Egypt with the Persians, and in an earlier period, still others had been sent to Egypt to help Psammetichus in his campaign against the king of the Ethiopians or Nubians. It appears that following this figure's campaign against the Nubians, a Jewish outpost was left to guard at the southern part of Egypt. So Professor Bezalel Portin wrote in May to June of 1995 issue of Biblical Archaeology Review. He said this: the Jewish community at Elephantine was probably founded as a military installation at about 650 BCE during Manasseh's reign. A fair implication from the historical documents, including the Bible, is that Manasseh sent a contingent of Jewish soldiers to assist Pharaoh Psammetichus I in his Nubian campaign and to join Psammetichus in throwing off the yoke of Assyria, then the world superpower. Egypt gained independence, but Manasseh's revolt against Assyria failed. The Jewish soldiers, however, remained in Egypt. So that's the theory on how they got there, how the community was established. You know, how do Jews end up back in Egypt? This is a good question. How do you get this reverse exodus? That's the theory. Because of the assistance Manasseh provided Egypt, the Pharaoh likely allowed the Jews to maintain a presence at the Elephantine fortress, and due to the political situation in Judah, they may not have been able to return easily. Manasseh was an incredibly evil king who, partway through his reign, was taken captive by Assyria. and is mentioned in the ancient Assyrian records. The Elephantine Jewish community is unusual in that it kept very few biblical customs, and although they worshipped at a temple somewhat resembling Solomon's layout, biblical law forbade the establishment of such an edifice, and yet there were tons of them. Further, the Elephantine papyri show the community used the Aramaic language rather than Hebrew. This has bewildered some scholars. One theory is that these Jews were originally from a northern community located in Syria, perhaps something like the northern Judahite outposts mentioned in 2 Kings 14:28. Perhaps this community was also made up of the pagan Samaritan contingent, which had replaced the northern kingdom of Israel after its final defeat in 1718 BC. Or 718 BC. In any event, the state of religion during the reign of Manasseh was arguably worse, more bloody than that of the surrounding heathen nations. So it should not be a surprise that the religious practices at Elephantine would be Jewish in name only. Now, Herodotus described this fortress in his histories. He says, in the reign of Psammetichus, there were watchposts at Elephantine facing Ethiopia. And still, in my time, the Persians hold these posts as they were held in the days of Psammetichus. There are Persian guards at Elephantine. Persian governance and Jewish community at Elephantine are both attested in the Elephantine papyrus, and it's to the Persian period that our key papyrus dates. So, Elephantine papyrus number 30 begins, quote, to Bagohi, governor of Judah, from the priests who are in Elephantine to the fortress, or Elephantine, the fortress. So they're writing to this governor of Judah from this community. The letter, a copy of the official dispatch that was sent to Jerusalem, discusses the temple of YHW, which is a form of the Hebrew YHWH, Yahweh, the divine name, that had been built at the Elephantine fortress, and a request for the permission to rebuild it after its destruction by Egyptian troops. So we saw that previously. That Vidranga, the wicked, in a letter sent to Nephina, his son, wrote, the temple, which is in Elephantine, the fortress, let them demolish. Afterwards, Nephina led the Egyptians with other troops. They came to the fortress of Elephantine with their implements, broke into that temple, demolished it to the ground, and the pillars of stone which were there, they smashed. So that's how it got destroyed, and that's why you then see them asking, hey, come help us rebuild it. The papyrus continues, we sent a letter to our Lord and to Yehohanan, the high priest, and his colleagues, the priests who are in Jerusalem, and to the Astanis brothers of Anani and the nobles of the Jews. Yehohanan is a longer version of the name Yohanan, son of Eliashib, the high priest who served during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. The same Yohanan is mentioned in Ezra 10:6 and Nehemiah 12:22 through 23. So let's actually maybe just quickly go to Ezra 10:6. Let me pull it up here. Okay. Then Ezra withdrew from before the house of God and went to the room of Yehohanan, son of Eliashib. While he was there, he ate no food and drank no water, because he continued to mourn over the unfaithfulness of the exiles. So you can see he's there. This person is being testified to in an extra biblical document. So this isn't a guy who the Bible just kind of made up. It's not some myth. It's recording history. Of this high priest, Yehohanan, the first century historian Josephus records some intrigue. Apparently, there had been a falling out between Yehohanan and Bagohi, the governor addressed at the start of the letter, who had probably taken over from Nehemiah himself. Josephus records that Bagohi intended to install Yehohanan's brother Yeshua in his stead as high priest. Yehohanan and Yeshua argued in the temple, and in a fit of rage, Yehohanan killed his brother. Josephus relates that in divine punishment, the Jews were enslaved and the temple desecrated by the Persians. Some evidence of the dispute can be gleaned from the papyri, while the Elephantine Jews appeal to both Bagohi and Yehohanan the reply from Begonia approving the construction of the temple, and made no mention of the high priest. Now, there's another figure who's mentioned in the Bible and is confirmed by this community, Sanballat, the governor. Towards the end of the papyrus, it reads, "Moreover, all these things in a letter we send in our name to Delaiah and Shelemiah, sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria." This Sanballat, the first, the Honorite, governor of Samaria, is mentioned numerous times throughout the book of Nehemiah. So Ezra is being confirmed, and the book of Nehemiah is being confirmed by this extra biblical papyrus. He was a sworn enemy of the Jews who were attempting to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem under the leadership of Nehemiah. He was actually related to Yehohanan, the high priest. His daughter had married into the priestly family. Together with Tobiah the Ammonite and Geshem the Arabian, Sanballat attempted unsuccessfully to stymie Nehemiah's efforts in reestablishing Jerusalem. Sanballat sendeth also Geshem, thinking to do to me evil, according to Nehemiah 6:2. The Wadi Dalia Bulla also most likely refers to this Sanballat, with the broken inscription reading, it's kind of broken off there, it's corrupted, son of Balat, governor of Samaria. There's a small chance, though, that this Bulla could refer to a later Sanballat that ruled in the following century. The name Sanballat came from the Babylonian name Sinbulalit, meaning Sin, the Sumerian moon god, had begotten. So Sin had begotten. The word Honorite is sometimes translated as Haranite. Haran was an ancient city in upper Mesopotamia near the border of Turkey and Syria. The Honorites were likely among the nations transported to Samaria to replace the Israelites. So that's effectively that part. Let's skip down just a little bit. The Elephantine Temple Papyrus is an intriguing document from an intriguing community, proving a number of biblical elements, most notably the existence of Nehemiah's arch enemy Sanballat and the high priest Jehohanan. So there's just so much that we're getting out of this community. Like there's so much going on. One other fascinating thing I had to bring to y'all's attention, and this is actually when I first heard of this community, probably, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, somewhere around there, because I was really big into like Ark of the Covenant kind of stuff. And so I saw a guy who was doing a documentary on the Ark of the Covenant, trying to retrace its steps or whatever. And he went to the Elephantine Island and, showed a place where he thinks that the Ark of the Covenant sat on. I think Graham Hancock has also done some stuff on it. I know some people will question whether or not he's authoritative and reliable. So here it talks a little bit about this. Scrolling down. Although the Temple Mount in Jerusalem was the last known location of the Ark of the Covenant, its date of departure from the temple is a topic of much debate. The last known reference alluding to the Ark's presence in the temple dates from 701 BC, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib surrounded Hezekiah's forces in Jerusalem. Isaiah states, and let me zoom in here. And now I got to refine my place because I zoomed in. Okay. Isaiah 37 states, and Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. Then Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, saying, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, and the one who dwells between the cherubim. This reference to the presence of God's Shekinah glory abiding above the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim, sculpted on the lid of the Ark, seems to confirm that the Ark was still located in the Holy of Holies in 701 BC. So that's kind of the theory, is the last time that we know about it, it was around this time. It appears that the villain in the drama of the Ark was the subsequent king Manasseh, and that the Ark most probably was taken out of the temple during his reign. Although the extent of Manasseh's evil does not allow a full description here, the Bible summarizes his deeds by noting that he did more evil than the nations of the Lord had destroyed. He practiced wizardry and sorcery, placed pagan idols in the Holy of Holies, and shed innocent blood far and wide in the streets of Jerusalem. Our belief is that a pure Levitical priesthood left over from the days of Hezekiah would not have tolerated the degrading and polluting of the temple containing the Ark of the Covenant. It's even possible that Manasseh would have ordered the Ark removed from the temple before installing his own debased idols. Whatever the reason the Ark was removed, it is interesting to note that just a short time after King Manasseh, King Josiah mentions the Ark's absence from the temple. In 2 Chronicles 35, it says this: Then he said to the Levites who taught all Israel, who were holy to the Lord, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders. This not only appears to confirm that the ark had been removed from the temple, but also that the priests had been moving it somewhere in the manner prescribed by Levitical law. But if the ark of the covenant was removed from the temple during Manasseh's reign, where was it taken? That's where the Elephantine community comes in. So we have discovered historical evidence that during the reign of Manasseh in Israel, a colony of Jews, including Levitical priests, migrated from Israel and founded a colony on Elephantine Island in Egypt. It's strongly possible, if not probable, that the Elephantine Jews were escaping the desecration and persecution of the wicked king and that they had the Ark of the Covenant with them. Speculative, right? In our visit to Elephantine Island, we thoroughly investigated ruins of a replica Jewish temple that had been built by 650 BC, which precisely matched the dimensions of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Of course, the practice of building temples outside Jerusalem was strictly forbidden by Deuteronomic law, although clearly it was done very often. So only the most dire circumstances would have compelled a group of Jewish refugees to undertake such a project. I don't agree with that. I don't think it was a dire circumstance. I don't think that follows based on what we've seen already, where it was actually pretty common. Moreover, a temple replica would have been fruitless at the time, at that point in history, without serving its primary function. I don't necessarily agree, but they continue. A number of ancient documents, such as the Elephantine papyri, seem to confirm the existence of a Jewish temple at Elephantine, Egypt, or at least certain districts of Egypt would have been a safe haven for Jewish refugees. Skipping down a little bit. What's more, our scholarly contact in Egypt has concluded from his own investigation that the Ark of the Covenant did indeed come to Elephantine Island during the reign of Manasseh in Israel, and that it was housed in the replica temple. The scholar is Dr. Atif Hana, curator of the Aswan Museum. So he's arguing it was there. However, Dr. Hana has also determined that the replica temple was destroyed for unknown reasons, possibly the advance of new aggressive form of idol worship in 410 BC. That event then raises the question, where would the ark have been taken? Where might our search lead us to next? And then they go to Ethiopia. Okay. So, but here it's curious that you have this scholar, Dr. Atif Hana, curator of the Aswan Museum, who has concluded that the Ark of the Covenant was there. And some people have gone there, have looked at the location and said that the size of the Ark of the Covenant would have rested here. And then they showed exactly where that is. And it matches up with the size according to the Bible. And so, nothing absolutely conclusive, but there seems to be something to the theory that the Ark of the Covenant may have been there. So there's just so much going on with this community, and I think that many more fascinating things will be discovered as researchers continue to look into this, scholars continue to look into it. There's just so many implications that we get out of what we already know about it. So I've found it to be incredibly fascinating. I hope that y'all have as well. If y'all want to see more videos like this, just continue to let me know in the comment section, and I'll continue to make some more biblical archaeology videos if these are of interest to you. If they are, maybe let me know a specific topic that you would like. But if you're enjoying the biblical archaeology stuff, we can do more of them. I've already created a little playlist, and I got the one with the previous temple in it, as well as this one, and we could continue to make more. But yeah, do let me know your feedback there in the comment section. Also, let me know your feedback by subscribing and hitting the like button. If I'm saying that people are subscribing and they're hitting the like button and they're commenting, then I know there's enough interest for us to continue to explore some of these fascinating events. All right, so that's going to do it for today. See y'all later. God bless.